Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance podcast. I'm your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose. Hello, everyone.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to you as well.
Good to see you as always.
Yeah.
Today,
guest.
Today we are broadcasting from the pinnacle. I feel like this is like the peak of Mount Everest. I should wear snow gear because we're the peak of the hype cycle
Hang on,
conversation.
You did do some hiking recently.
I did.
You should share this with the audio sphere.
There's
The audio visual sphere.
Yeah.
I don't know. Whatever.
the-
Somebody called the podcast a vlog the other day. They
really.
messaged me. I was like, well, it is video. Is there a good word for video podcast? Or vodcast?
I don't
Is there a
know.
good word? No.
It's just two people talking on camera at that point.
But tell us about your hiking adventure.
Oh no, it was. There's this challenge in the UK called Three Peaks, where you go and do the sort of three largest peaks in the UK in a 24-hour period, or at least you try. A lot of it's dependent on the time it takes you to drive between locations and whether you're sleep deprived during those drives and not so.
I saw the pictures. You had snow as well.
We did, yeah. Weirdly, not on Snowdon. Snowdon was the sunniest and super hot. It was Ben Nevis up in Scotland had a bunch of snow on top. So yeah, it was good fun though. Very good fun.
And then you drove right past my house. Didn't even
I
stop
did.
to say hi.
No, I also drove by Wrexham.
Yeah.
For those who are fans of the TV show, which also is a podcast reference
This is true.
number of episodes ago.
Yeah.
But today we're on a different peak.
Why the
peak,
mountain?
the peak of the hype cycle of AI,
Indeed.
which has come raging back now, and everybody's talking about the impact in the future of AI, and they're writing articles everywhere about the transformative power of AI in insurance. You and I are both quite happily people who look at the future and the impact of tech and all these types of things. Futurists.
Yeah. Put that on my CV.
Put that on my LinkedIn title.
Yeah. Noted futurist Ben Rose says that AI won't change insurance just yet.
Yeah, exactly. Gravestone. Never saw that coming.
Yeah, exactly.
But because of the sort of launch of ChatGPT, which is arguably very cool for doing certain tasks, I think it's re-sparked this like excited everything is going to change, and we are looking at and reading a number of articles more recently, and they come out with all manner of how this will all look different. The one that interests me the most, or I found the most entertaining because how absurd I found it, was a piece by one of the large consultancies, oftentimes going by the firm. We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
And it was about what the impact of AI in insurance would be in the year 2030, which is not terribly far away. But here starts the journey that we go on. An individual uses their automated personal assistant and tells invisible Alexa in the sky they need a vehicle to go to a meeting. The vehicle drives across town and picks them up. Upon entering the vehicle, they decide that they want to drive, and they're prompted that they're going to have the insurance adjusted because they're going to drive. They proceed to drive to the meeting. When parking their car, they hit the pole, and then it automatically calculates and creates their claim by having like a drone come in. But here was my issue amongst this entire framework that they lay out. I'm reading this going, you sent a vehicle across town that was summoned by a genie AI. And then upon getting in the vehicle, which you could have gotten in for free, you chose to pay insurance to drive yourself there. And this
was it? Yeah.
and then this vehicle that can drive itself. Then the vehicle that can drive itself all the way across town, navigating traffic. Not that you're behind the wheel, you just like thump it into a lamppost.
We would get worse at driving.
I was like,
if we only cars were driven by
But surely the car would have like an auto brake stop feature that doesn't let you smash it into stuff.
Apparently not.
And I was like, there's just a lot happening here.
Okay, so this actually,
and this is mind you only a few years away, Ben. Brace yourself for the future.
They played it super safe. Let's be honest. 2030. They
this
say,
should be by June 2024.
Well, they say you always overestimate the change that will happen in the next 2 years and underestimate that which will occur in the next 10. And by the time it gets anywhere near 2030, things will have happened that make everybody, forgive the firm for
these
childish views of them. No, I'm kidding.
um,
But it's funny you said that, because it reminds me a lot of the feedback given to, I don't know if you've seen Apple's recent play into
Vision Pro.
yeah, like, personally, by the way, side note, augmented reality, love it from a sort of conceptual view and all this sort of thing, and I'm actually quite excited. I was devastated when they pulled Google Glass all those years ago. So quite an interesting topic. But when they were doing the demo day for it and launching all the new features, etc., it's like, well, what are we going to be able to do with it? We're like, Microsoft Teams calls, all right, FaceTime, but not on a screen, and they couldn't really come up with anything more exciting than basically stuff you can already do on your phone. It feels a bit like that with the AI examples you just gave in that report, where it's like, well, what could we do? You could actually just drive the autonomous vehicle.
Yeah.
That also you could not drive. You could get a drone to do a claim in a crash that you probably shouldn't have. It starts to feel like one of these classic tech looking for a problem to solve.
Yeah, and I think we're really, really bad at thinking outside of our actual experiences when we look towards the future, right? Even if you think of like the Jetsons, like they have flying cars, but then traffic jams as they all sort of leave for work at the same time, and their flying vehicles are just lined up on roads in the sky that are all blocked up now, and they sit like, surely if we can get to flying vehicles, we have solved for traffic congestion a bit better.
We'll never overcome queuing.
No, exactly. No, exactly. We love a queue. But the point you raised earlier, I think, is the really interesting theme that underlines all of this, as there's this real excitement about the future of insurance and how AI in its various forms is going to transform how this industry operates.
I would disagree. I would say there's a huge excitement about AI, and insurance people don't want to miss out. So they're like, insurance is going to be done. It's like, well, no, AI is a thing, and you want some too.
Well, and maybe that's sort of the thought behind my point is, the insurance industry is known to be behind all the other industries for a reason.
Yeah.
So whilst sort of across society, I think it's exactly right, the quote that we'll overestimate what we can do in 2 years, but underestimate what we can do in 10 years. I think when it comes to insurance, I think we're massively overestimating what change will happen in 10 years. The technology that we have today, like, we should have been able to be doing electronic trading across our industry from a purely technological point of view for decades now. Like, there's other reasons why this industry is slower to adopt things, and there's certainly going to be some super interesting things about extracting data from contracts. There's certainly been interesting things about how we improve engagement with clients and customers, but I think it's going to look relatively similar as it does today in 2030.
I think, I mean, maybe it's worth, just for the sort of audience benefit here, explaining why now and why is everybody so excited about AI again. I guess because people will remember everybody got excited about AI years ago for other reasons, and before that, again, different versions of what artificial intelligence means. I guess it's important to highlight that this is one of the first real successful forays, I guess, into generative AI versus some of the actually often active other AI use cases that have been around for a decade or more.
Yeah. Well, I think the generative piece is generally very, very cool. And if you've used ChatGPT and you've asked it questions and it like writes a story about whatever topic you want, and then you ask it to write it in Shakespearean English, or like, it's just very impressive and it feels amazing. So I think that it's re-sparked people's imagination on what it can do. But the generative AI models that write stories that reflect humans aren't actually, like, they're trained on data, but sort of static cuts of data. And so it oftentimes will make things up. It will like
hallucinate.
It'll hallucinate is the term they apply to it. I was reading this morning. There's a claim in the US right now about a lawyer who wrote, have you seen this one, where he files his motion writing ChatGPT, and essentially the position is the statute of limitations has expired for his client's thing, and he asked ChatGPT for examples where the statute didn't apply, and it gave him like 6 cases, and he slaps the motion down. He's like, here are evidence for all the reasons. none of it's true, right? And so now this person he's I think being sued or something, and he's like, I just thought I had information that I didn't have access to. You're like, what? From
So,
where? It's not, so you're having a bit of this happening.
and this is the funny thing, right? Where it's two different versions of ChatGPT, and some of them could be, sorry, of AI. Some of them could be very useful. For example, by creating sort of pools of association and being able to quantify the relationships between words and groups of words, we are able to use AI to infer similar meaning from single words or groups of words to enable it to effectively, very convincingly appear to understand what it's talking about. But in reality, it's continuing to just statistically guess what the most appropriate word to put in at any given time is.
Yep.
If you use that in a extractive sense, it means it can read things in quite a clever way. So it can read, so the lawyer example, it can look at loads of case law and look for examples where this sort of thing has happened. It might be able to realize that we should consign this case to the trash heap of history. Means the same as we should ignore this case. And use that in a useful way. However, that's if it's accessing real sources and it's being used to group things in a completely different application to the way that ChatGPT exists. ChatGPT, on the other hand, is generative and is creating stuff, often stuff that doesn't exist at all, on the basis of what it expects stuff to look like. To the point where, as you said, it invents legal cases that sound incredibly convincing. It invents code that looks incredibly convincing. It invents website addresses. We used it the other day where I was looking just as an experiment to try and find, articles or to pair common mentions between, certain events and so on. And I said, show me your sources. And it invented sources, literally made up website addresses that were incredibly convincing, www.bbc.com/ and then a really convincing end of address. But when you clicked on it, it was like, oh, funny, this doesn't actually exist. But using its knowledge of frequency of form and what the form of these things should look like. So it's all kind of form and no content in some ways on the generative side of things. So if you want to use it if you can provide it with the content and ask it to improve the form, it's actually being really useful. I know like lots of coders are actually finding it quite useful as a form checker. And we've had, Copilot-y type things for a while that do that. I think there's another one in the law world called Co-Counsel that again would look and just sort of spot things for you so that you are able to check your form. But I think the thing that people need to remember is that there does need to be a driver who's checking and in some cases providing completely on their own the content that they actually want to run with. But ChatGPT can help you with the form.
And I think this is one of the bigger applications that I feel exists in insurance, is just making it where, because we've had this complaint against the industry for a number of years, and Lemonade sort of really raised this maybe 5 years ago. But this complaint that policy wordings are very, very complicated, especially for end consumers. This is more the insurance side than the reinsurance side, which are also complicated policies. But where you have it where a general consumer doesn't quite understand how their policy should work, and they look in to read a policy document and they are left more confused. And the ability for one of these models to answer questions based on a specific thing and interpret, as you said, relatively complex legal jargon, but then just distill it into a simple layman's person's version of this thing. So those areas I think are going to be very, very interesting. But the applications to like underwriting and like the likelihood of claims, and I think we're at this current point in time a little bit overly ambitious around the impact that might have, right? This sort of, we'll use the hundreds of thousands of data points to do all this stuff in real time. We had all the same conversations around blockchain of like, you'll do this thing and the whole universe will recognize that action has taken place and everything will update in real time. Like, I get the ambition there, but it doesn't feel as likely that we're going to get to those sorts of things.
I think even the founders have come forwards, right, and said themselves, handle our new thing with care. It's in its infancy. And unfortunately, one of its greatest skills is looking credible and looking convincing.
Yeah.
So if there's one thing that they're very good at, these large language models, it is convincingly making up and telling you stuff that isn't fully correct. And I think a lot of analyses have now been done to suggest when you should use these generative AI models and when you shouldn't. And if you're looking for accuracy and reliability, typically the advice is steer clear. Because it is this black box that you don't know how it's generated the results that you asked for. Often if you hit refresh on the same request word for word, you'll get a different response, even if it's got numbers in it. You know, and so on. So I think for us, while we did look, you know, as part of the wave of the hype curves excitement at like, oh, could Supercede be using, you know, this in our application? Actually, I think we're steering quite sharply the other way and saying we want to be transparent about how data is transformed. We want to be fundamentally mathematically accurate and reliable in everything that we do, so that you have that confidence that it's not been hallucinated when you're doing something really important like buying reinsurance.
Well, yeah, and that veracity of data and the authenticity, accuracy of it is fundamental to everything in the insurance value chain. And as ambitious as we might get around improving the speed and efficiency in which people work, the most important thing across every step of the insurance chain, from the end consumer looking at a quote online to the retro premiums, requires the data to be accurate and correct. And even if there's small chances of data being manipulated or incorrect and inaccurate, it's going to have a lot of knock-on effects. And I think our industry, rightfully so, has an aversion to making those mistakes. And so we'll continue to err on the side of patience and caution, and away from going, well, we don't quite know, let's have another human double check that, because that human will recognize that doesn't make any sense. Again, I think the future will be a sort of hybrid model, but I think you'll see a slower adoption in our industry, rightfully so, because we work in a different product than tons of interesting, user consumer products.
It's funny, I actually met yesterday with somebody from one of the big challenger banks. And we had a conversation about OpenAI and said, are you exploring it? And they said, well, to be honest, we've looked at it, but it's not what we do. At the end of the day, people want us to be a bank and to be reliable and accurate. And that's where we put our energy into building very robust technology for that. So again, an exciting distraction, maybe, for fintech. Maybe something that can be used for distribution or engagement, customer engagement, this type of thing, but not something that's going to inform very important interactions where the numbers matter.
Yeah. Well, and the difficult position I find myself in when thinking about it is, as much as we've kind of gone on this, here's why I don't think this is going to change everything in the next 5 to 10 years in our industry. Part of me still harbors this position of, am I the person in 1994 talking about how the internet is going to be such a dumb idea? You could never buy things, or you can never trust a source. Well, weirdly, we can't anymore. But you had this at the introduction of the internet, when that became a thing. Huge numbers of skeptics coming out going, here's why this isn't going to change anything. And in hindsight, they look very, very silly. So there's always a part of it in the back of my mind kind of going, am I missing something with this? And there's enough things that are changing. I think it will have a bigger impact, and it will apply to certain industries, as you said, more than others. But I'm still harboring this nagging thing of going, is there a thing that I just am fundamentally wrong on that means insurance will look fundamentally different, and you will summon a self-driving car that you can then crash in 6 years' time?
I think people will find it. I think it's important to caveat our comments as reflecting AI as it is now. In very mass market, publicly available versions of these large language models. I think already a lot of people are trying and putting a lot of energy into, how do we make these more reliable? How do we, train the model on very specific data sets? and ensure that it doesn't hallucinate where possible or go rogue, so that maybe they could explain to customers
Yeah.
what is covered by their insurance policy and what isn't, without saying, "Oh yeah, that's definitely covered," and even
Yeah.
elaborating further that,
Yeah.
And so is this space flight to the moon as well.
Well, I think you're right so one of the big concerns the industry is having around a chat GPT and the other sort of open source ones is if putting real data into it and client data and protected data into it, because once it's there, it's on the internet essentially. It's going to be there forever. And there's a massive spike in companies building private, you know, GPTs and in other environments in private clouds that they can inject their own data and then do work within their own secure data set. And the industry's been doing and making a sort of a land grab on data for a number of years now, following the sort of the data is the new oil position that we've talked about for a number of years now. But I wonder if this is going to have any impact on like an M&A environment. Like, for example, if we use Aon, could Aon be interested in buying like a claims company? Because they could then ingest this universe of claims that company administers, and they have now that data source that they can layer on. Like, might it change? Because M&A in our industry, we've talked about before, has always been like access to new markets or new products or those types of core things. But if data is the really powerful thing that can feed these models, might you see a growing diversity in M&A targets?
Maybe, and I guess this is perhaps a way of linking together the two different strands that we talked about at the beginning, in the sense that if generative AI depends on the training data, then is extractive AI, as in that which can be used to scrape and comb through, relevant sources, the key to building the intelligence needed to then create actually more useful generative AI? In which case, sort of a double-edged sword in the sense that you're holding the sword, rather than it's twice as sharp and dangerous.
Yeah.
But I mean, I know that for years and years we've talked about data is the new oil, and data is the bedrock of insurance companies, knowledge and assets. They've got loads of data, but they don't know how to access it. It's trapped within PDFs and PDFs with JPEG images stuck on them randomly and all sorts. How do they use OCR or otherwise to actually get characters out of that information, and then how do they interpret it and get it into a structured set of information that can then be used initially to gather facts, but now potentially not just to gather facts, but actually to train a generative AI that can then take those facts forward and redeploy that intelligence for something else without somebody having to step in and do that. But it would be such a big black box, right, in terms of, and how did you get to that conclusion?
Yeah. Well, and the ability to have absolute certainty that everything is correct, right? So if you have, you write a policy and you have it translated into a new language or do something else, and if anything has changed, like that person now has a legally binding policy with fundamentally wrong information to it, which, there was a piece in the Insurance Insider that Marcel wrote that I thought was excellent. It was a two-part piece. But he talks about as well the sort of need to bring in sort of regulation and government bodies, because as you say, that especially like rating agency, if you're using sort of AI models to better price and risk and all these types of things, like the regulators hate models that they can't interrogate. But you have to submit your rates in advance, you have to get approval for your new rates and all these kind of things. So whilst again the ambition is to like look at how we could transform this whole thing, there's regulators that sit in front of there, and there's
ethics of AI was already a minefield before generative AI.
So like when you kind of go and exactly, what if it's like, oh, they're in this income bracket in this part of the city, so just like that the AI has done something here. Like all of that is just a minefield, and it'll be interesting because you have to bring in a lot of different parties, and this industry will adopt this slowly because it's going to have to kind of tackle and address those things.
Yeah, it's an exciting one. And in some ways, I think because we've been on a few of these journeys, working in insurtech and innovation for a while, I'm quite eager for us to fall into the trough of disillusionment after the peak of the hype curve,
Yep.
because that's when the real use cases start to come out.
Yep.
And where some hardy little startups and innovation teams around the industry will actually start some real things moving.
Yeah.
That's when you can really see how this is going to pan out.
Well, and I used this example a couple of years ago at the InsurTech Insights conference, an analogy, which you know we love analogies. But it was a reference to like the Jetsons, and they were looking at the future, and
I love the Jetsons.
I do love
I've
the
never
Jetsons.
seen the Jetsons.
You've never seen the
No,
Jetsons?
it
Ah,
sounds-
Hanna-Barbera from the
Oh,
1950s.
Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, it's all the same. Yeah,
Mm.
well, not the same.
Is Scooby-Doo in it?
Scooby-Doo doesn't make a. I don't know. I wonder if they've done
Can we
done
hear
like those.
appearance?
It's like the Flintstones and the Jetsons meet Scooby-Doo. It's all the
Yeah.
whole happy family. But when they sort of projecting the world forward, and I talked about the traffic jam
Yeah,
incident a bit ago, but they also had Rosie, the robotic maid that wheeled around the house and
Mhm.
would do dishes and would
Yeah.
do the laundry, like the way you did it in the 1950s.
Yeah.
But she was a robot,
Yeah.
right? And what we
All the
got
gender
in.
dynamics of this robot as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it had the little
Yeah, I can picture it. I
thing
think
around her
I've
waist.
seen the apron.
But when we actually leaned into solving problems for people that mattered,
Mm.
we got washing machines, and we got dishwashers, and we got a tool that was built for a specific purpose that said, I have a bunch of dirty dishes, and I don't want to spend a bunch of time doing that. I don't need a robot to drive around my robot. I pronounced that very weird. I don't need a robot to drive around my home doing tasks.
Yeah.
There are specific things, and I think this will be another instance of that. Right now, we're kind of in that it could do all the things like and just insert people tasks. But I think what we will find for it is some unique elements that like proofreading a paper. Like, here's this thing I've put together, maybe with support of things, or help me finish a sentence, but you polish this piece up, remove that, help, like elemental improvements and things. I think we'll see.
Identify where the form of this thing differs from the normal.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think the sort of overall episode, I know we started with a consulting example, but an old adage in the consulting world is not boiling the ocean. Right? If you want to get a cup of hot water, you can either boil the ocean and dip a cup in it, and then you've got a cup of hot water, or you can just get a cup of water and boil that.
Yeah.
But I think that's very much the case there. We want to make it easier to do the dishes, and so we will entirely build a humanoid organic organism out of metal and wires as the first challenge. Try and do all of that first, just in order to get clean dishes. I think at the moment we are at the stage of like, we could boil literally the entire internet's worth of information, in the hope of getting one small cup of useful generative AI. But as people start to realize exactly what they want to come out with, what is the cup of useful boiling water that you want, then they'll be able to actually work with a much more precise and useful starter set.
And this is the thing that I think we enjoy sort of spectating on in the hypes curve, is from the peak, you then where it can do anything. What's it best for? Everything. Like, it's just capital all caps locks and exclamation points. It can do everything. And we look at what it will change and how the world might look, and everything will be different. There's somebody just screaming at you. It's all different. And then you realize that probably won't change, and that won't either. And all of a sudden you're on this slope as it drops down into this trough of disillusionment. But the real interest and excitement is that as you come out of that and you reach the plateau of productivity. Yes, I think I got it.
Goodness me, you're a Gartner pro.
I am a master of a Gartner hype cycle. But you come out under this plateau of productivity with some really interesting things. Now we've found the use cases and the types of things that are most important, and it's deployed into those areas to immense effect, and everyone's happier, right? Yes, it never did that thing, but that thing wasn't actually that big of a deal anyway in hindsight, right? So I think with this, I'm really excited to see where it goes, especially with things like art and making little things really easy to do, where it's not going to transform or take away artists, but it'll allow people to be creative in smaller amounts, or people to write stories and get the imagery created for it that help them, like those types of things I think are really engaging. It might be, harmless and nice.
Are we allowed to carry out? Yeah, we've got a minute or two. Yeah. Okay.
We can
Because you mentioned the art
Corey.
thing. The art thing's really interesting. So I've been looking into this a bit as well. Because of the form-content relationship here, right? The form aspect that it trains itself on. What should art look like? Some vague taxonomy that it's trained on. This is 18th century whatever versus impressionism versus pointillism. I don't know. For visual, for example, but equally for music, for all sorts of areas where you can apply this. But what it means you end up with is always pastiche, right? Never anything especially original. Which is very interesting then, because what starts to happen and what we've seen start to happen in the AI art world is creativity around the content. So some artists, I think there's one who won the Sony Photography Award with a fake photo recently, where, as far as they were concerned, the role of the artist was in determining the perfect prompt for one of the image generating AIs that would give it something very interesting when it hit the go button almost. And I think similarly, poets using AIs, authors, anyone using the medium now of artificial intelligence to generate something, the role of the artist changes not that much in some ways. It's just that your paintbrush is now artificial intelligence. Your instrument, whatever it might be, that's now artificial intelligence, and your job is to come up with a prompt that gives you what you want on the canvas at the end. And weirdly, that's becoming a skill, right? Like if you look at how complicated some of the prompts have been to generate really interesting AI art, and not generic or particular moods or striking things, that's where the art's coming in now.
Well, and I think that is kind of a natural evolution of art in many ways. If you look at modernist art, which people have sort of, it's the Marmite of the art world, I think, in many ways. But it's very easy to go into a modern gallery and be like, well, I could have painted a door red, or I could have arranged cans on the floor this way. But what the artist is doing...
Did you, Jared?
but I didn't, did I? But what the artist is doing is they're saying, this is conveying this concept in a way. Like, it's the same thing as the prompting here, saying an artist is preparing a prompt to elicit emotions based on a certain framework that they're working within. And the output of that will still differentiate. Like, yes, it's a photograph of garbage in the city, but like the one that you and I might take on our phones versus the one that made it into a gallery is different for a number of reasons. And I think we're going to see something very similar with the prompts, and the art will be in how do you prompt it to create something of actual artistic value.
We got profound in this episode.
Oh, it's deep. AI, really? I love it.
We should do some random episodes on completely unrelated topics. Probably
the Reinsurance podcast, of course.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder how much of our Reinsurance following would continue to follow us into. And here's an episode purely about philosophy.
I think we should do one completely rogue one time.
Yeah, we have to have a chat with our marketing department and the producers and see what they think.
Until next time, wait for the next completely rogue episode of the Reinsurance podcast. Thanks, everyone.